Hello, New Prospect. Welcome to RTB 2021 for September 20th, 2021. Hope you're having a great start to the week on this Monday, and hope you had a good weekend. So our text for today, let's jump right on in. We've got 2 Samuel 16, 2 Corinthians 9, Ezekiel 23, and then Psalm 70 and 71. So let me start with, I've got my Bible open to 2 Corinthians, so we'll start there. Here, Paul is returning to an issue that he had discussed earlier in chapter 7 and 8, returning to the subject of the collection of money for the church in Jerusalem, for the help of those believers who are going through a difficult time. He explains how he's sending Titus and others so that the Corinthians will have their contribution ready when Paul returns to them and visits them. Points out how he has boasted of their willingness to help, and that he, along with the Corinthians themselves, would be embarrassed if he was able to arrive and they weren't prepared for giving this. This is in verses 1 through 5. So Paul then encourages them to give generously. Here we have perhaps the most famous verse on giving, it maybe even in the Bible, which is in verse 7, that talking about how God loves a cheerful giver. The generosity would do a couple of things. Not only would it supply for the needs of those believers in Jerusalem, but it also served to kind of unite the Jewish and Gentile believers. Of course, this was a problem in that early church. Just to make a few mentions on that issue of the cheerful giver, this is actually a common theme that we see in the Old Testament as well. We see it reiterated in Proverbs 22:9, and then you also see it, of course, in the story of the Exodus, where the Israelites are raising materials, getting material donations for the tabernacle. And so it points to how God desires not just for us to give, but he's concerned about the heart with which we give whatever we're giving. Right? He's concerned about the attitude that we have, and it's our heart in the right direction. He doesn't want us to just give just because we have to, but it's something we should give because this is a desire that we have, that we want to give as Paul says here, not under compulsion, but as we've purposed in our hearts. And I think we have a lot of folks at New Prospect who do just that. So 2 Corinthians 9. Let's move over we'll go to Ezekiel. So Ezekiel 23, this is returning to an issue, and this is a little bit of a harder text as well, that it's very similar in some ways to Ezekiel 16. Remember that really long text where God is, it's kind of the parable where God is telling them this message about how Israel had been raised up from their birth and had then committed adultery against God. Really has some difficult language to deal with in there, and this is very similar. It's telling in this case about Oholah and Oholibah. These are names that are related to tents. The Hebrew word tent is ohel in the Hebrew, and it this is where the connection between Oholah and Oholibah to Samaria and Jerusalem in terms of the original meaning of that word is a little bit unclear. It could be that it's just referring to how they dwelt, or it could be referring to that this is where these evil deeds were occurring, or it could be referring to something having to do with idol worship as well. We're not exactly sure, but at the very least, we do know, based on this text, who these two women are referring to. And of course, the first refers to Samaria, and then the second refers to Judah. And then, of course, just like in chapter 16 of Ezekiel, these two women go and commit spiritual adultery against God, and it's portrayed as physical adultery as they're going after these other nations and other gods. Shows something of the severity of the sins in which Judah and Samaria are engaged in. But of course, remember that at this time, Samaria is not in existence anymore. They were taken into exile in 522 BC. And so it's interesting as you read through this, for instance, in verse 11, where it says that her sister Oholibah saw this. This is Judah, and he looks upon Samaria, and even looking upon the judgment that came upon her, she was more corrupt than in her lust than she. Now, this would have been shocking to the Jewish people at the time, being compared to Samaria, the capital of the northern kingdom. The northern kingdom had been taken into exile, as I said, by the Assyrians, and this was after a 3-year siege of Samaria, the capital, that resulted in the northern kingdom being completely decimated. And of course, if you read through the history of the northern kingdom, they had no king who was faithful, no king who was good. And so for a Jewish nation, a Jewish king, a Jewish people to be compared to Samaria, who had experienced this devastating judgment, would have been a devastating type of prophecy, a devastating type of condemnation on the part of Ezekiel here in Ezekiel 23. So once again, Ezekiel pointing to the future judgment that's about to come upon the Jewish people, and God, as you read at the end, is certainly going to make them, verse 32, drink their sister's cup. They will experience the same kind of judgment, and that's exactly what happens. That Jerusalem itself endures not as long as a siege as Samaria did, but certainly a long one, a 1.5 year long siege, which would result in the same judgment. Exile, this time at the hands of the Babylonians rather than the Persians, who had taken Samaria into exile. So anyway, that's kind of the background of Ezekiel 23, and that brings us to 2 Samuel 16. Get over there. So remember that where we are in the story, we're seeing the decline of David and his kingdom, which had reached its high point, of course, with 2 Samuel 7, and then had reached its low point when he committed adultery with Bathsheba. And from that point onward, it's been a downward spiral. It's interesting, once again, I think I pointed this out, that David almost becomes a parable for Israel. Well, what we just read in Ezekiel 23 shows what had happened, right? David had fallen in his lust, in his adultery. So also Israel had fallen, Judah had fallen in their lust and in their adultery in a spiritual sense. And so David's pattern that he establishes here is the pattern that Israel itself would follow. And we see some more of the impending problems that have arisen in David's family because of the sin that he introduced into it through the sin with Bathsheba. We first of all are introduced to Ziba, a servant of Mephibosheth. Remember who Mephibosheth was, the son of Jonathan, who David in this previous chapter just extended grace to. And this false servant is basically falsely accusing Mephibosheth of trying to establish his own kingdom, to reestablish the kingdom of Saul. We learn later on from the story that Mephibosheth will come back and say, well, this wasn't true. So this guy is just trying to tell lies in order to place himself higher in the kingdom. And in fact, David ends up giving him all that belongs to Mephibosheth. So again, we see this kind of disruption and disorder in the kingdom of David. David then, and this is a shaming instant, a relative of Saul, David's passing by, and he proceeds to just throw curses and dust and dirt at David the whole way. Now, this should have been punishable by death. David extends mercy to him, but at the same time, once again, it's showing the shame that is coming upon David through the many things that he had endured. And then finally, at the end of this story, we have, of course, the story of Absalom, who enters in Jerusalem and establishes himself as king. So your son is even revolting against you and establishing his throne and basically staging a coup here. And he does so by taking his father's concubines, which is problematic as well, obviously, when it comes to David. So David's house is definitely in a state of disorder here. And once again, I think for an Israelite reading this, they would see that even in our height, even in the time where we were, that we look back with the most fondness, the time of David, there was a sense in which not all was right, because we didn't have a king who was leading us rightly. We had a king who had in fact failed, a Davidic king who had failed, and the failure of the Davidic kings will be the story of the rest of Israel's history, and of course points us to the need for a Davidic king who would not fail, who would lead the people rightly, who would lead them into righteousness. So that's 2 Samuel 16. Finally brings us to two lament psalms, Psalm 70 and 71. Psalm 70, if you'll remember, is, and let me make sure I'm getting this right, Psalm 70 is about this exact same as Psalm 40. Psalm 40 verses 13 through 17, you'll see pretty much the exact verbatim. We see this every now and then in the Psalms, where Psalms will repeat themselves. We saw this, for instance, with I believe it's Psalm 53 and Psalm 14. And if God repeats himself, perhaps it's something we should take note of. So take note of Psalm 70. And then we have Psalm 71, also a psalm of lament. This is a psalm and I think I may have mentioned this the first time we went through the Psalms. If I did, then I'm sorry, I'm repeating myself. I can't remember what I say anymore. But I do have a little note in my Bible here. Sometimes I'll write in my Bible, and I'm sure many of you do as well. In verse 6 of this psalm, in Psalm 71, I says, "But behold, or by you I've been sustained from my birth, and you are he who took me from my mother's womb, and I praise you. My praise is continually before you." I have written on here 10/17/05, which just so happens to be my birthday, October 17th. And so, so I had read this on my birthday, and I guess it just so happened I was reading this reading through the Bible on my birthday, and read through this text, and it just so happened to be a text about how God had sustained me from my birth. So I thought that was kind of cool. But it really shows you, this psalm shows the confidence that the psalmist has in God's care throughout all the totality of his life. He talks about from his birth, and then in verse 9 he talks about in the time of his old age. And so from the birth to old age, God caring for and bringing him safely to the end. This is also a time in my life, I don't know how much I've shared with you about this, but this was a time where I was about to start teaching for the first time. In fact, that January was when Elizabeth and I were going to move down to South Georgia and start teaching at Bruton Parker College, a small Baptist college down there where I first started teaching. Came here in 2010 to teach at Anderson, but I taught there for about 5 years. So when I was reading through this psalm on that birthday in 05, I was reading through and praying through verse 18. That's a great thing to do, by the way, is just to pray through these psalms, because they are in fact prayers. And my prayer was from verses 17 and 18. "Oh God, you have taught me from my youth. I still declare your wondrous deeds. And even when I'm old and gray, oh God, do not forsake me until I declare your strength to this generation." So my prayer on that day, at least as I began to teach at Bruton Parker, was that I would declare your strength, the strength of God, to that particular generation of young adults who were training for the ministry there in South Georgia. And that's still my prayer even today, that as students come through, that what I will do is I will declare not just some facts about the Bible, but I will declare the greatness and the glory of our God. And I know that's the prayer for many of you as well. So a little trip down memory lane for me today on this day, September 20th, 2021. Hope you have a great rest of the day.